How about we talk about some tricky concepts related to Chapter 17, the endocrine system. First of all, what do we mean by a hormone? Well, a hormone is a chemical messenger produced by one cell, released into the bloodstream, travels a great distance in the body through the bloodstream to a distant target cell and alters the cellular function there at its target. Now, how does it alter the function of its target cell? And what do we mean by target cell? Well, first of all, a target cell is a cell that possesses a specific receptor for that hormone. These receptors are large proteins. Now, they're expressed either on the surface of the cell membrane, where they bind peptide hormones, or these receptors are expressed inside the cell, in the cytosol or the nucleus. And those receptors most typically bind steroid hormones and the iodinated thyroid hormones. Affects a cell. Hormones change the status of their target cells. May increase production of a certain protein, they might open an ion channel, they might lead to contraction. In the end, though, a hormone has an effect on a target cell because of the ability of the specific receptor to associate with that hormone. All right, let's talk about the different classes of hormones. Well, there's lots of ways to classify hormones. Typically, they're classified by either their structure, their chemical nature, or by their relative solubility. And of course, the structure and solubility go together. For instance, steroid hormones are lipids. And as lipids, they are relatively hydrophobic. That is, they're poorly soluble in water. Plasma is mostly water. So steroid hormones are not very soluble in plasma. They travel with chaperone proteins. That increases their solubility in the plasma. At their target cells, steroid hormones bind receptors inside the cell, in the cytosol or the nucleus. And then the receptor hormone complex becomes an activated transcription factor. So steroid hormones and the iodinated thyroid hormones have an effect on their target cells by altering the expression of specific genes. Peptides and amine hormones are small hormones that are derived from single amino acids. These hormones are highly soluble in plasma in water. They are hydrophilic. They don't cross the lipid bilayer of cell membranes well. Thus, we'll find the receptors for these hormones on the surface of the plasma membrane, membrane-associated receptors. When the peptide and amine hormones bind their membrane-associated receptors, they alter the production inside the cell of a second messenger. The hormone can't get inside the cell. It relies on the production of another chemical messenger inside the cell to carry out some functional change. That other intracellular messenger we regard as a second messenger. And lots of examples of second messenger systems. What does this second messenger do inside that cell? Well, it may do lots of different things depending on the hormone and the receptor and the cell type. But that second messenger might open or activate an ion channel. It likely activates an enzyme, increases enzyme activity. It might stimulate the release of calcium from the SR. Lots of possibilities for the actions of that second messenger. The last part of this tricky video, there'll be more, I want to deal with the hormones of the anterior pituitary. Now, the hormones of the posterior pituitary are pretty straightforward. Those hormones are vasopressin, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. Two peptide hormones, both neurohormones, because they're produced and released by neurons from the hypothalamus that extend all the way down to the posterior pituitary. These are neuropeptides. Oxytocin and vasopressin are peptide hormones. We know what they do. Confusion comes in talking about the hormones of the anterior pituitary. Now, the anterior pituitary is not neuronal. It is not neuron endings like the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is truly glandular and is truly an endocrine tissue. There are 5 different cell types in the anterior pituitary, producing and releasing hormones. These cells respond to hormones from the hypothalamus. And this leads to the scheme I keep talking about in the voiceover slides, kind of a hierarchy of hormones with regard to the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, and target tissues. Let's draw it on the board. Whoop. Let's make sure we can see it. The hypothalamus in the brain responds to lots of different inputs, a lot of different information coming into the hypothalamus. Some of that information will dictate that the hypothalamus produces and releases a specific peptide hormone. This is one of the hypophysiotrophic hormones, whose sole function is to stimulate the release of a hormone from the anterior pituitary. So, each of the anterior pituitary hormones is controlled by at least one hormone from the hypothalamus. That is, it's controlled by a hypophysiotrophic hormone. These hormones of the hypothalamus are all peptides. And in our scheme, we label them as hormone number 1. The hypophysiotrophic hormone. Specific example, CRH from the hypothalamus. This hormone, hormone number 1, travels at very short portal circulation from the hypothalamus down to the anterior pituitary, where it regulates the release of hormone number 2. So this structure I'm drawing is the anterior pituitary. This will respond to this hypophysiotrophic hormone from the hypothalamus by releasing a specific hormone. Hormone number 2 in our scheme. Specifically for CRH from the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary responds by releasing hormone ACTH. All of the hormones of the anterior pituitary are also peptides. Hormone number 2 travels to its target cells. That is, it gets into the bloodstream, travels through the general circulation, and binds to specific receptors on target cells. Just draw it like this. There, on the target, hormone number 2 stimulates the production of yet another hormone, hormone number 3. So I've labeled it target cell and hormone number 3. ACTH stimulates the production of the steroid hormone cortisol from the adrenal cortex. Cortisol has lots of effects, as we talked about in the voiceover slides, including, importantly, raising plasma concentrations of glucose, free fatty acids, and amino acids, increases circulating energy sources for metabolism. So that's the action of cortisol on its targets. Importantly, you should remember that hormone number 3 also has receptors on the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. Hormone number 3 ultimately controls its own release through negative feedback processes. Sorry, I'm getting kind of messy there. Cortisol has receptors on the anterior pituitary, and it will shut down the production of ACTH from the anterior pituitary, negative feedback. Cortisol also has receptors on the hypothalamus and will shut down the production and release of CRH, negative feedback. In this way, generally speaking, the actions of hormones aren't prolonged or exaggerated for too long. Now, before we leave, let's talk about all the hormones of the anterior pituitary, because we need to know them. And remember, they're all peptides. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, stimulates the release of T3 and T4, those are the iodinated thyroid hormones, from the thyroid gland. The next hormone, ACTH. We just use that one in our example on the board. This stimulates the release of cortisol from the adrenal cortex. Next come two closely related hormones, and actually they're produced by the same cell type in the anterior pituitary. These next two are collectively, together, they're referred to as the gonadotropins. Follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, luteinizing hormone, LH. I bracketed them with a little asterisk there to remind you that they're actually produced by the same cell type in the anterior pituitary. These two hormones are named for their functions in the ovaries, but they also have functions in the testes. All right, follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the maturation of the ovarian follicle, and in males, it allows for the maturation of sperm. Luteinizing hormone regulates ovarian function, ovulation, release of the oocyte, the egg. We'll see that next chapter. And it also allows for testosterone production in males. 1, 2, 3, 4. Growth hormone stimulates general growth throughout the body, somatic growth, as we say, particularly with regard to the skeletal and muscular systems, growth hormone. Prolactin is our last anterior pituitary hormone, also a peptide, as they all are. And prolactin stimulates mammary growth and milk production. And I often get asked, well, what's the role of prolactin in males? The primary action of prolactin, one of the major actions of prolactin, is the stimulation of the mammary gland growth and milk production. But in general, prolactin is stimulatory to all integumentary structures, skin and hair as well. All right, these are the hormones of the anterior pituitary. They get into the circulation, bind to receptors on target cells, and stimulate the production of a third hormone, all except prolactin. Prolactin is the exception to that rule. It does not stimulate the production of a third hormone. So I'll leave the review and tricky concepts at this point and ask you to draw out which hormone is number 3 in the scheme. That is, which hormone is produced by the binding of these hormones on the board to the target tissues.